Thank you, Madam Chair. I think there's a couple things that we should talk about for a second because I think they're important. And one of them, I'm going to go to the Fourth Amendment in criminal context and how this could be deployed there. And this isn't the first time we've seen the Fourth Amendment crisis in the Fourth Amendment. It happened with telephoto lenses, it happened with distance microphones, GPS trackers, drones, and now we're at facial recognition. And to be fair, the Fourth Amendment has survived over time pretty well. But biometric information has a different connotation, which I'll get to in a second. I also agree with Ranking Member Jordan that we can't leave this for the courts to decide. And one of the reasons we can't is the courts are going to take a constitutional view of privacy, not a popular culture view of privacy. And so when we're into the civil context and data sharing and these types of issues, I'll be the first to admit my facial recognition didn't work on my phone over Christmas. You know what I did? Drove immediately to the cell phone store and got a new one. So I understand the convenience of it and those things. But the Carpenter case is a pretty good example of how at least the U.S. Supreme Court is willing to change how they view privacy in the digital age. So part of our job as Congress is to ensure that we write a law and write regulations that ensure that we can maintain those types of privacy standards. Now, one of the reasons biometric, and I wish some people were here, is a little different is because there's one unique thing in a criminal case that is really, really relevant to facial recognition, and that's identity cannot be suppressed. I can suppress a search, I can suppress 40 pounds of marijuana, I can suppress a gun, I can suppress a dead body, but you cannot suppress identity. So as we're continuing to carve through these, one thing I think we have to absolutely understand is in these types of cases, we need to apply a statutory exclusionary rule. Otherwise, any regulations we pass don't really truly matter in a courtroom. And two, we have to figure out a way for meaningful human review in these cases. Because when they say we will never prosecute somebody solely on facial identity, well, that's a fair statement, except there has to be an underlying offense of a crime, so they're prosecuting them on something else as well. And it's really, really important. But I also think it's important to recognize that not all populations are the same. There's a big difference between using facial recognition in a prison setting and even, quite frankly, in a TSA or a border setting than there is for a law enforcement officer walking around the street with a body camera or people getting profiled at a campaign rally. And so we have to continue to have those conversations. But I also want to point out that one of the things we have to do when we're dealing with these types of things in the law enforcement scenario, and I don't care what law enforcement it is, state, local, federal, DEA, all of those issues, have to figure out a way to account for false positives. And the reason I say that is, and I'm going to use not an apples-to-apples analogy, but in North Dakota, we have highway patrolmen have drug dogs. Not all of them, but some of them, and they're multi-use. I mean, our law enforcement usually has those. So if you're speeding down the street or speeding down the highway going 75 and a 55, and you get pulled over, and that highway patrolman happens to have a drug dog in his car, and he walks that drug dog around your car, and that dog alerts, and they search your car, and they don't find any drugs, and they let you leave, and they give you your speeding ticket, and you go along your way. That data never shows up in that dog's training records. It never shows up. So when you're talking about the accuracy of a drug dog, when you're talking about the accuracy of finding a missing girl or any of those issues, we cannot wait until that situation arises. Because if there's a missing girl on the mall out here, I will be the first one standing at the top of the Capitol steps saying, use whatever technology to deploy, grab everybody you can, let's find this little girl. And I agree with that there. But you cannot have regulation unless you have meaningful enforcement. And one of the concerns I have when deploying this technology in a law enforcement setting is it is very difficult by the nature of how that works to deal with those false positives, like my questions are, when we're talking about the missing girl or the rice cookers, is how many people were stopped? How many people were stopped that weren't that person? I'm glad they found her. I'm glad they caught the guys. But we have to be able to have a situation in place where we can hold people accountable. And the only ways I can think of to do that is to continue to develop this. One, use it in populations where, and perfect it. Now, the problem with a prison population is you have a static population. The problem with the mall outside is it's a completely variable population. But I think when we move forward with this, particularly in a law enforcement and criminal setting, we have to recognize the fact that you cannot suppress identity. So it is different than a lot of other technologies. Because if your number is 90% and you stop somebody at 60%, and it still happens to be that person, under current criminal framework, they're not I can make that motion, the judge will rule in my favor and say, too bad, still arrested. So with that, I yield back. And if this body would pass a law into effect that shut off everybody's facial recognition on their iPhones tomorrow, I think we would have a whole different kind of perspective on this from our citizens. So I think identifying people quickly and easily has so many positive law enforcement and safety applications that I think it would be irresponsible to disregard this technology completely. More importantly, I think the private sector, and so my intent isn't, when I'm asking these questions, is not to demonize law enforcement. They will use whatever tools are available to them, and they should. I think we should also recognize that there are very responsible large corporations that want to get this right. And they don't want to get it right just for the bottom line, although that is helpful. They have corporate cultures as well. They have things, and more importantly, there are those of them arguing for a federal regulatory framework. Our job is to get it right. Our job is to ensure that we have responsible regulation that protects the privacy of all Americans. But part of doing that is recognizing that it's here. And in some way, shape, or form, it's going to continue to be here. And there are a tremendous amount of positive applications that can be used. But there are dangers. And there are significant dangers. And because for every reason why there's a positive application for identifying people quickly, that is an invasion on everybody's privacy who is in that particular space. So we're going to work with it. We're going to continue to use it. It is causing tremendous consumer convenience. There are lots of different applications, but we have to be cognizant of the fact that this is a little different than a lot of other things, because identity is something that can never go away once it's been identified. And right to free association and the right to do those things is fundamental in the American population. And anything that has a chilling effect on that has to be studied very, very closely. And I agree with Mr. Jordan in when we know how this is being used. And I also agree with Mr. Connolly. Technology will advance. Human reviews will exist. Things will happen. This will get better and better all the time. I don't want any false positives, and I don't want any false positives based on race, age, or gender. But my number one concern is not only those false positives, it's the actual positives, where they're doing it, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. And we have to understand that while this technology has a tremendous benefit to a lot of people, it poses real significant and unique dangers to fundamental basics of First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment rights. And we have to continue to work forward and work. I should also say, this isn't the first time the government's been behind the 8 ball on these issues. We're so far behind on online piracy. We're so far behind on data collection, data sharing, and those types of issues. And one of the dangers we run into with that is by the time we get around to dealing with some of these issues, society has come to accept them. And how the next generation views privacy in a public setting is completely different than how my generation and generations above us viewed privacy in a public setting. And the world's evolving with technology. And this is going to be a part of it going forward. So I appreciate everybody on both sides of this issue. And I appreciate the fact that we had this hearing today. And with that, I yield back.